Father Peter will be talking on the topic refugees, how it is a global problem, and he suggests a regional solution.
Oh, it's great to have the opportunity to speak to you coming from Australia. I would much prefer to be there in person to speak with you, but of course with the COVID-19 pandemic being worldwide, we're all experiencing different ways of communicating, aren't we? So, greetings to my friends in New Zealand. Firstly, I just want to say that Australians hold New Zealand in great admiration. Recently, our national broadcaster, the ABC, did a survey and they asked, if you couldn't live in Australia, where would you like to live? It was amazing that most of the responses, people said New Zealand. I think that you've had good leadership in your country from Jacinda Ardern, especially amidst some of the crisis that you've experienced, especially that horrible massacre in Christchurch. So we do keep an eye on what's happening in New Zealand and very proud to be your neighbours. So today I'd like to speak to you about the situation with refugees and people seeking asylum. It's something that I believe is very important in our region, not just for Australia or just for New Zealand, but indeed for our whole Oceania region. Firstly, perhaps it's good to refresh ourselves about what the worldwide situation is with refugees at the moment. There are currently 70.8 million people displaced from their own homes. 70.8 million, it's a huge number. Of those, 41.3 million are internally displaced. That is, they're still living in their own country, but displaced from their homes. There are 25.9 million refugees. Most of those are under the age of 18 years. 3.5 million of them are seeking asylum in various nations throughout the world. So 80% are living in countries bordering their own nation. Why? Well, when you ask refugees what they want, there are three things. This is in order. Firstly, they want to be able to return to their homeland in safety. Most of them have fled because of war, persecution, religious strife, and so forth. And so they want to go home. Failing their ability to be able to do that, they want to live somewhere next door or as close to home as possible, so that when the strife that they're experiencing in the homeland finishes, which they hope and pray will be soon, they can return home. Their third and most least desired option is to settle in a third country outside their region. That's why so many of them have come to this region of the world. Australia has had quite a history of migrants and refugees. After the Second World War, we received people from Europe in their thousands. There were people who were trying to find a better life after the war. Many were also fleeing new communist regimes, which had them concerned for their own safety and were experiencing persecution. And so our country has been built on that migration. They have contributed vast amounts in terms of their labour, their welcoming society, and so we've grown to be a very multinational society here in Australia post Second World War. The next major wave came after the Vietnam War, that terrible conflict which just dragged on for so many years. When that finally finished in the 70s, we opened our borders and people from Vietnam were welcomed here. Many of them came by boat, just as what current refugees and people seeking asylum do. Then it was just as treacherous a journey. Many of them were attacked by pirates, and yet once they did reach Australia, they found a welcoming home. In most of our capital cities, we established refugee centres where people were looked after and cared for and given a start to a new life. That Vietnamese wave of refugees have made an enormous contribution to Australia as well. Not long ago, we had our first refugee Vietnamese bishop, Bishop Vincent Long. He is currently the Bishop of Parramatta, just outside Sydney, and he sits on the Bishop's Commission for Justice, Peace and Ecology. Vincent is only one of those people who have made a great contribution. So what happened? Somehow we've become far less welcoming in this country. Since the 13th of August 2012, anyone arriving in Australia or in Australian waters has been detained on the island of Nauru and Manus, Manus being part of Papua New Guinea. They're detained there for processing, supposedly, and yet it has been so protracted. Many of them were first taken to Christmas Island, which is a part of Australia, and then transferred to either Nauru or Manus. Since July 2013, successive governments have stated no one from Manus or Nauru will be settled in Australia. And so many of them have been given what they call TPVs, a temporary protection visa, which lasts for only 3 years. And at the end of that 3-year period, they have to reapply. They also may be given what's called SHEV, which is a Safe Haven Enterprise visa, which is for 5 years. But they all experience mandatory detention. Just recently, the Australian government has withdrawn what is called SRSS funding, Settlement Resolution Support Services. So now people who are living in our community who have been released from detention have no financial support. So they are now looked after by the not-for-profits. And there are many not-for-profit organisations caring for refugees and people seeking asylum who are living in the community here in Australia. Last year, Father Giorgio Lucchini, who is the General Secretary of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, contacted me and asked for a meeting while he was here in Australia. When he came, he was very disturbed about the situation in Papua New Guinea. Gradually, the Australian government has closed down Manus Island and has moved the refugees and asylum seekers into PNG, into the Port Moresby mostly. Pardon me. They are living in hotel accommodation, which is quite difficult for them. It's usually just one room. Father Lucchini was concerned that no one from Australia had visited Papua New Guinea, especially those from the Bishops' Conference, and asked if I would arrange a delegation to go and meet with him and to see the situation in Port Moresby. So I enlisted a number of people, amongst them Bishop Vincent Long, our own refugee bishop, Carolina Gattado, who heads Jesuit Refugee Services in Australia, representatives from CAPSA, which is a Catholic alliance for people seeking asylum, and then representatives from some of the major religious orders, the Dominican Sisters and the Passionists primarily. So we arranged to go to Port Moresby in November last year. We met there with the Catholic bishops of Port Moresby and Greater PNG area. We met with Kador Padule, who is the UNHCR representative there. We also met with the Apostolic Nuncio, at least Vincent and myself. But by far what was most instructive was meeting the refugees and people seeking asylum. We heard their stories. We heard their plight of having fled various places around the world, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Rohingya, so many of the trouble spots around our world. To be perfectly honest, I was very moved by their stories, the violence that they'd experienced, the deaths of their family and loved ones, and their desire just to live in a place of peace. And yet what happened? They got to Australian waters and were put onto Christmas Island and then transferred to Manus and then transferred to Port Moresby. This has been a 7-year journey for many of them, and they are desperate. The thing that I experienced from most of them was the mental illness. You can just see it in their eyes, how desperate they are. They also have very poor physical health. I recall one man showing me his arms where he had tried to self-harm while in Manus. Another young man, only 21, set fire to himself to try and escape. In doing so, he burnt down one of the buildings on Manus Island. These people were desperate, and there they were living in relative squalor, it seemed to me. The other part of their transfer to Port Moresby was to a detention centre called Bomana. Bomana was attached to the Bomana jail in Port Moresby. It was built by the Australian government at a cost of $22 million, and it housed at that time 49 refugees or people seeking asylum. That is, they hadn't had any determination of their status. One young man, Hamid, had gotten out of Bomana, and he told me it was torture. He said, you were tortured when you slept, because all we had was a very thin mattress with no pillow and no blanket. We were tortured when we ate because the food was so substandard. We were tortured when we were washed because there was only cold water in the showers. The only way that they could get out of Bomana was to sign a VPR, a voluntary repatriation order. Part of the reason for that was that the Australian government could not send them home because unless they went voluntarily, they would not be accepted in places like Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. And so they signed what was supposedly a voluntary order. Hamid said to me, when I go back, he said, as soon as I land on Iraqi soil, I will be arrested. I will be imprisoned. He said, and possibly I will be put to death. He said, Hamid, why are you doing this? Why are you going home? He said, Father, there are two reasons. He said, firstly, I had to get out of Bomana. And secondly, he said, my family is being persecuted at home. And I'm hoping that if I return and face the authorities, that perhaps my wife and children will not be persecuted as they have been. A chronic story, I must say. We visited many of them living in these hotel-cum-hostels at places like Granville and City Apartments, they're called. In addition to this, because Manus had opened up, a lot of them had also married. That meant that they now had local PNG wives and children. One man told me that he had been granted refugee status and could be transferred to America. The problem was the US solution did not include his wife and children. And so he stays in Port Moresby. No job, no income, just being looked after by Caritas International, who are caring for him. So the situation has become somewhat critical up there. When I returned to Australia, along with Bishop Vincent Long and Carolina Gattado, we went to visit politicians in Canberra to try and advocate for these people in Bomana. Gradually, our advocacy, amongst many others, has worked, and people have been slowly released from Bomana. Many of them have been transferred to Australia, but are now held in detention in hotels in Australia. such as Preston's in Melbourne. Around the same time, Australia also revoked one of their best ways of getting out of PNG, and that was through the Medivac transfer. So if they were vitally ill, and they had to be vitally ill, they were transferred to Australia for medical attention and often sent back. One young doctor in his late 20s was transferred to Brisbane to the hospital there to be treated for his mental illness and his physical ailments. He threw himself off the top of the hospital building and was killed. This is a terrible plight that these people are through. So, what can we do? Well, we realise that there are many people working to care for refugees and people seeking asylum in Australia. And so my office, the Justice and Peace Office of the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney, decided to call them all together. They are all caring for them on the ground, looking after them in terms of their food and clothing and shelter, and they're also trying to advocate. But it seems to me that there were so many of them working in silos, that what we needed was to gather together to try and have a united voice and a united effort to help with Australia's policy around how we are looking after refugees and people seeking asylum. That work continues. We have been advocating with around about 70 representatives of these different groups, speaking to government, speaking to agencies, trying to get a softer, more humane approach to them. We're just currently establishing a website so that we can stay connected with what we're all doing and allow people to share information, allowing them also to come on board with different advocacy projects and to speak to government. Ultimately, however, I believe that we need a regional solution, one that speaks to all of Oceania. This began with Father Giorgio Lucchini talking to me about how Australia and Papua New Guinea bishops' conferences can work together. And I believe that we can also extend this to New Zealand. In part of that crisis, your government offered to resettle 150 refugees into New Zealand. But the Australian government said no. Why? They believed that it would just be a pathway into Australia because of the free movement between New Zealand and Australia. I find that rather lame, given that they could have put provisos on visa entry into Australia. They wouldn't even accept the help of our friendly neighbours next door. What would a regional solution look like? Well, firstly, I believe the only solution must come in the form of a solution which encompasses this whole region. We may have stopped the boats from coming to Australia, but they are going to start again. There is no doubt that there is still a lack of peace in those countries, and so the wave of refugees will start again at some point, and we need to be ready, perhaps, with a solution which impacts the whole of our area. In November 2018, I was invited by Cardinal Peter Turkson from the Roman Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development to speak at a conference which they were holding. The conference was to mark 70 years of the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, and I was to present on what were the human rights issues in Oceania. The two things that I focused on most were refugees and climate change. I think also there is going to be a coalescence of those two things, because as we know in our region, climate change is beginning to cause people to be refugees or migrants. Places like Kiribati are already experiencing climate change, and some of their islands are just sinking. They've already bought property from Fiji to try and transfer some of their population. So I think that's going to be a growing issue in our region. The two things seem to coalesce, although there is some sense in which those people fleeing climate change are probably more migrants than refugees in the true sense. What would a regional or an Oceania solution look like? Well, I think it's complicated, and I certainly don't have the answers. But I think there are some elements that we can consider, which I'd like you to consider too in New Zealand. Firstly, we would like to work on getting together the three bishops' conferences, primarily Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. That our bishops could have a united voice around a humanitarian response to refugees and people seeking asylum. We've forgotten sometimes the power of the voice of the church. And when we work in coalition with a united voice, it can have a strong impact in the region on all governments. Based on Catholic social teaching and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we can put forward a case whereby we need to meet our obligations, not just here in Australia, but regionally, to care for these people. We are already, I think, in Australia in contravention to UN decrees which we have signed, the declarations, and yet somehow we continue to flout them. I think what we need is a fast and humane way of processing people who are seeking asylum in Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of this region. Perhaps that can be done in offshore places at their first point before they arrive in Australian or New Zealand or PNG waters. So, for example, Indonesia may be a staging ground continually for refugees. Perhaps the Australian government could invest in putting money there to process quickly and humanely people to come to Australia. Further, I think that we need to clearly increase the numbers which we take. Australia is a vast nation, and I often think that one of our problems is our lack of population given our size. During this COVID-19 crisis, there's been lots of discussion around our lack of manufacturing, because when the world shut down, we have struggled with importing many of the things we require. And so people have said, well, what's happened to our manufacturing? Well, what's happened is that we don't have the population, firstly, to consume or to produce many of the things we need. So I would advocate that we need an increase in our population, and that can be done through migration and refugees and people seeking asylum. I think that we need a realistic intake and a realistic treatment of people who are fleeing such horrible circumstances. I think as Catholics, we look to the Pope for his example. Do you recall when that boat was wrecked in Lampedusa? What did Pope Francis do? He went down there straight away and he got people to construct an altar out of the wreckage of the boat, and he celebrated Mass for those people. He has continually shown compassion and welcome and challenge to other nations around refugees and people seeking asylum. But part of doing that is changing the story. I've been a great advocate for refugees and people seeking asylum, I hope, for quite some time, but it has grown by my ability to meet and talk with them. It's very hard, isn't it, to demonise another human being when you've shared a meal with them, when you meet them, when you hear their circumstances. That's what we need to do more and more. In Australia, refugees have been demonised. We call them boat people, queue jumpers, economic migrants. In 2013, the lie was spread that they were throwing children overboard from refugee leaky boats. That all turned out to be not true. So we need to change the conversation. I think that's elemental in what we're doing. One of the ways in which we've tried to do that is that here in the parish, which I'm parish priest of, in the inner city parish of Leichhardt, we've established a welcome refugee centre. People said to me when I first started to do this, why? There are no refugees or people seeking asylum living in the inner city. They're all in the poorer areas in the southwest of Sydney. But my response was, to welcome migrants and refugees is a responsibility of the whole city. And so with the help of our local council and Settlement Services International, we have established a centre where we bring people seeking asylum, and they come and they learn to cook, they share their skills, we look after their children for them, and we help them how to navigate this city, advice and other essential needs. I think that one of the important elements in this is the principle of non-refoulement. So many people who we've sent back and said are not genuine refugees have been killed, persecuted, jailed. Phil Glendenning runs the Edmund Rice Centre here in Sydney. He's been a great advocate for those going back to Afghanistan, and Phil travels regularly there. He was telling me just recently that 80% of those who we've sent back to Afghanistan, claiming that they are not genuine refugees, have been killed within 12 months. That's an horrendous figure. This requires not just action by government, it requires civil society also to be involved, our churches and not-for-profits. The government in many parts of the world have abrogated their responsibility to care for these people, and particularly in Australia, it's now left up to not-for-profits to feed, clothe, house and provide for refugees. And that then moves on to Catholics and other people of goodwill who are providing for those services. So it needs to be government and civil society working together in Australia, in New Zealand, in PNG, and together to find solutions. We need to prioritise capacity building of local and national actors as part of a long-term solution. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to get together a coalition, firstly, of people working in this space in Australia, but I would like to expand that to Oceania, to challenge the bishops of Australia, of Port Moresby, of PNG and the Solomon Islands in general, and indeed the Bishops' Conference of New Zealand. Together we can work to put pressure on governments, we can come up with solutions, we can show our strong Catholic voice in the tradition of Catholic social teaching, where we are going to help heal and welcome those who are most disadvantaged in our world. Just finally, I'd like to challenge you to think about whether you would like to be a part of that movement, whether you would like to gather together some who would be interested in joining in this fight for these people who are so marginalised. I know that you are doing great work in New Zealand. I know that each of you is a great supporter of social justice. I think it's so easy to lose that in a world that is so intent on economics rather than politics, of making money rather than caring for people. We can turn that conversation around together. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
We hope you have enjoyed listening to Father Peter's talk on refugees. If you would like to share a comment on Father Peter's talk, please email us at pastoraloffice@cda.org.nz. And we thank Father Peter for his time speaking to us on this forum. And we hope that you will continue to join with us on our next monthly talks. Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Catholic Diocese of Auckland Commission for Ecumenism 2020 Talk Series, promoting Christian unity. Now that seems like a lot in that phrase. I will unpack it for you in a minute. My name is Louisa and I work for the diocese. A key part of the mission of the diocese is to promote ecumenism, which is unity amongst the Christian family, and interfaith, which is building relationships with people of other religions. So why are we here? Our 2020 talk series is focused on ecumenism. How did we start up the 2020 talk series? On the 25th of May 1995, Saint Pope John Paul II promulgated his encyclical letter called Ut Unum Sint, that they may all be one. The letter reflects the Pope's deep longing for genuine Christian unity. So we are not only celebrating the 25th anniversary of Ut Unum Sint, we are also being reminded of our Great Commission, and that is to go forth and be missionary disciples. We have organized speakers to talk on a monthly basis topics around ecumenism, and these topics will be made available on our website, and we will also advertise them throughout the parish newsletters, and so you will know when these talks are coming up. The first talk is a pre-recorded video session with an international speaker, Father Peter Smith. But we must apologize ahead if the quality of the recording is not as spectacular, but it will get better. Now about the speaker. Peter Smith has been a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney since 1985. He is currently the promoter of Justice and Peace for the diocese, and he is a parish priest of the inner city parish of St. Columba's, Leichhardt North. Peter is an adjunct at the University of Notre Dame, Sydney, and teaches in the medical faculty. He is co-editor of the online publication Solidarity, the Journal of Catholic Thought and Social Ethics. In addition to publishing a number of articles, he also sits on the Anti-Slavery Task Force and End Street Sleeping Task Force for the Archdiocese, and a number of other committees, both church and civil. Peter was a visiting academic at Oxford University for a period in 2017 and has been a speaker at international conferences on human rights and Catholic social teaching. Father Peter holds a license in theology. Now join with me as Father Peter presents his talk.